Okay, so welcome everyone. So this is the July webinar for the 2019 International Webinar Series on Ecological Law and Governance. And my name is Emille Boulot, and along with the Economics for the Anthropocene project, I'll be hosting today's webinar on the topic of uncertainty and complexity in ecological law. So we're gonna have three 20-minute presentations by myself, Shalini Iyengar, and Jeff Garver, who has kindly agreed to fill in for Tani Pryor, who unfortunately was unable to attend today. And then we'll have a moderated discussion. So I will be providing an introduction to the topic. Shalini will be talking about the history and practice of environmental risk assessment and the environmental rule of law in India. And then Jeff will be talking further on issues of uncertainty and ecological law. And would really like for you to be involved. So if you have questions for the panel, we encourage you to write them into the chat box and we'll address them during the discussion. And Jeff will also be posting a sign-up sheet for ELGA's mailing list in the chat function, so please do sign up to that. And so I think today really is going to be a discussion around scientific uncertainty, risk, and ecological governance. And this is particularly pertinent as we enter the Anthropocene, and environmental law grapples with governing in a no-analog state. That is an Earth system with no comparable model, with significantly higher levels of uncertainty in our governance structures. So our more traditional linear, rational, and reductionist science to policy processes of environmental law are proving to be inadequate to deal with the uncertainties that are arising, that are not only analytical, but also normative. And the science to law interface must now attempt to move beyond kind of artificial institutional boundaries between science and policy, and explicitly recognize that environmental law and policy is informed by more than just scientific knowledge, particularly in the environmental law space. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview to the topic. I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll start my slides. And I will open these up, moving Zoom out of the way. So can everyone see them okay? Thumbs up? Excellent. All right. So uncertainty, complexity, and ecological law. And I will just, whoops. So what we do know is that our ecological systems are complex. Oops, moving along. Great. Our ecological systems are complex systems. So this means that they are systems that have collective behavior that is more than the sum of their components. They exhibit nonlinear relationships between the components of the system. They also have emergent behavior. This means it's behavior that's not implicit in the parts of the system. So the behavior is more than the sum of the components. They also self-organize. That means they support system identity and functions around a particular purpose. And when they're adaptive, this means that they exhibit coherence under external change as well. So complex ecological systems inherently have uncertainty, variability, and instability as inalienable attributes of their processes. This means that they are also indeterminate systems and they don't have equilibrium, and they exhibit radical uncertainty. So this means, radical uncertainty means that some information about the system cannot be known, not even in principle. So an example of this is that an event may happen in the future, but simply cannot be imagined in the present. And this also means that a probability, particularly in relation to kind of risk assessment, cannot be applied. So in terms of uncertainty, what do I mean by uncertainty? Well, as I just mentioned, there is uncertainty arising in complex Earth systems and in the ecological systems in which we live. There's also scientific uncertainty in relation to the information gap that we might have in terms of new and emerging technologies or not studied subjects, or a lack of historical data that might arise in relation to environmental governance. And there's also scientific uncertainty that arises just by virtue of the scientific method in relation to diverging scientific results, etc. And as I mentioned before, radical uncertainty refers to the idea that something may occur that we simply cannot conceive of. Environmental law, however, does not recognize our ecological systems as being complex or displaying uncertain characteristics. Rather, environmental law seeks to take a command and control approach to natural resources and situates the human sphere as one separate to the ecological sphere. So certainty in our laws and in our governance process is assumed to be possible. And like other areas of law, particularly in the common law systems, law seeks to ensure certainty for investment, markets, and international relations. And authors such as Vitus and others have argued that this has only been possible due to the stable climatic conditions of the Holocene. The epistemology, however, of environmental law has been one very much informed by environmental science. And environmental science must inherently recognize uncertainty as part of the scientific method. So this results in a bit of a dissonance between environmental law's epistemology and ontology. So environmental decision-making under conditions of uncertainty is largely limited to kind of rational, expert-led decision-making processes, which still all assume that certainty is possible. So we either have processes that assume that we can wait and develop better information before making a decision. We either take a cost-benefit analysis, which reduces all of the values of the decision to a monetary one. We either take a risk regulation or risk assessment approach, and Shalini will talk a little bit more about that in relation to risk assessment in India. In this case, uncertainty is assigned a probability. And then, of course, we have the precautionary principle. And so that's from, we've got on the right-hand side of the screen here, an excerpt of the Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration. And you can see there, highlighted in bold, that the precautionary principle assumes that certainty is still possible and that uncertainty is just temporarily limited. And there are a number of other issues as well with the precautionary principle, which I won't go into now, other than to say that it still assumes that uncertainty is only just a passing phase. So uncertainty, therefore, for environmental law really problematizes the ontology of traditional environmental law governance and institutions that attempt to take a command and control approach. It also hinders evidence-based or informed decision-making processes when certainty is assumed, resulting in what Philippopoulos Mihalopoulos has called an unsettling internalization of scientific uncertainty within environmental law. So ecological law seeks to address many of the deficiencies of environmental law. It's an emerging area of law. And it seeks to incorporate scientific and ethical principles into law and governance and recognizes humans as being embedded in ecology. And it's an alternative to kind of fragmented and reductionist approaches to environmental law, as it's based on concepts of planetary boundaries, ecological limits, and reducing material throughput. It also takes a systems approach to law as well. So to have ecological governance and decision-making, knowing what we do about our ecological systems being complex systems and exhibiting uncertainty, it requires us to acknowledge that uncertainty is the norm in ecological science and in our ecological systems, and that the world is characterized by deep complexity. So this complex systems understanding demonstrates that our traditional prediction and control kind of top-down approaches are of limited effectiveness in the governance of environmental systems, and that our existing environmental, institutional, and governance arrangements are insufficient. So how should, therefore, we govern moving beyond a kind of ontology of certainty and embrace decision-making under conditions of uncertainty and complexity? So in response to this, there have been a number of suggestions. Authors such as J.B. Rule have suggested that we should take an adaptive governance approach. And he states that we should be adaptively managing the complex adaptive legal systems to adaptively manage other complex adaptive natural and social systems. There's a lot of adaptation in that particular sentence. Adaptive governance can also be considered to be responsive governance. This is kind of idea of governance being open to input and ideas. It's also governance which requires ongoing monitoring and evaluation that has reflexive response systems. It's also aware and observant of the relationships between system components, so it's relational governance. And it situates the human sphere, well, often it situates the human sphere and the governance processes within ecological or socio-ecological systems. And it allows for small incremental change when information about a particular issue is insufficient to make longer-term decision-making. We also have kind of processes such as multi-criteria decision-making. So this is a kind of a response, I guess, in some ways to cost-benefit analysis, which reduces all values in the decision-making to a monetary value, but rather multi-criteria decision-making seeks to integrate a broad range of various and conflicting values and views. So these can be incommensurable. This means that they cannot all be commensurable to a particular monetary value, for example, or just reduced to just being monetary. Multi-criteria decision-making also requires public participation for an assessment of the cognitive and normative dimensions of an issue. It also requires critical analysis, value judgment, and transparency of assumptions. And it acknowledges that the systems or ecological systems in which we live are multidimensional and multidisciplinary. So this means that there needs to be many aspects of the issue incorporated, and it requires many disciplines as well to be involved. And then from ecological economics, we have post-normal science, which was from the work of Funtovitz and Ravetz, and I'm not sure that I'm saying their names right, but hopefully that's close. And so in this case, Funtovitz and Ravetz argue that post-normal science occurs when we have uncertain facts, where values are in dispute, the stakes are high, and decisions urgent. So the idea is that post-normal science is a departure from Kuhnian or normal puzzle-solving science, and is a response, again, to the multidimensional complex systems in which we live. So what post-normal science does is that it maps system uncertainties and decision stakes on two axes. So on one axis you have the level of involvement required to respond to uncertainty. Sorry, I'll say that again. So you have uncertainty on one axis, and then you have the decision stakes on the other axis. And as a result, this identifies level of involvement to respond to uncertainty and value conflict. So when uncertainty and the stakes are low, this means that the codified expertise or academic science is sufficient to respond and to make a decision in relation to whatever the issue may be. But when we have stakes are high and the uncertainty is high, for example, with climate change or ecological collapse, we acknowledge that legitimate social values and contrasting views need to be involved, and that science is only one of these particular views. So post-normal science, therefore, incorporates both social and technical incommensurability. So what we do know is that our kind of current traditional environmental law approaches, which are kind of more based on a rational top-down approach to the decision-making and to expert-led science kind of technical approaches and risk management, has largely failed us in relation to managing the kind of complex socio-ecological issues that we face today. And that there is also quite significant public distrust of top-down or expert-led governance. So science, in this sense, is necessary, but not sufficient as environmental law's epistemological foundation. And I think in any kind of new kind of conceptions of ecological governance, we need to acknowledge the importance of incorporating local and traditional knowledge and ensuring community engagement in order to have, in order to ensure that there is an unfettered decision-making power on the part of decision makers, and also to build consensus on issues and to develop new ecological ontologies for governance and epistemological pluralities as well. So in summary, to kind of sum up, I'll go back. What we do know is that uncertainty is inherent to the ecological systems in which we live. This raises significant challenges for kind of traditional environmental law, and it has environmental law up until this point and continues to do so, has internalized uncertainty and assumes that rational decision making is possible. Uncertainty challenges the ontological and epistemological foundations of environmental law. And in order for us to kind of keep talking about ecological governance and kind of developing what this discipline may look like, we must recognize inherent uncertainty in our ecological systems. And I will stop the share. And we will now hear from Shalini, who is going to talk a little bit more about risk assessment processes and the environmental rule of law in India. So I'll pass it on to Shalini.
Can everyone hear me? Is this clear? Perfect. Thank you very much to Emille for a fantastic overview. I think that was really clear, and I think the best way to follow on from that sort of very fantastic overview of uncertainty in law is to kind of show how Indian courts have at a very practical level been grappling with these issues. Because of course, at a meta level, while the courts may be cognizant of uncertainty, there are very clear limits to what they can and can't do and how they actually approach these issues. And I think hopefully the connections between that and the Indian courts' approach will be clearer as the presentation goes on. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And before I begin, I just wanted to issue a couple of caveats. The issue of risk assessment is very broad and often very sector specific. So what I'm going to try to do in the presentation is to discuss primarily the courts' response to risk and the Indian legislature's primary response to risk. And I'll be trying to pick out general trends and issues before going on to the idea of an ecological rule of law and ecocentric development in order to see what that might mean. I haven't prepared slides, so I'm hoping this will be more in the vein of conversation over the course of the presentation. In terms of structure, I'll be quickly looking at the history of the risk assessment framework in India. And following that, I'll be turning to how the courts have dealt with it, namely to essentially appoint expert committees and to use the precautionary and prevention principles. I'll be then looking at the EIA framework itself, the Environment Impact Assessment Framework under Indian law, before moving on to this new ideas of ecocentric development and environmental rule of law, which the Indian courts have begun very strongly supporting. So in India, as in perhaps most countries, environmental laws have traditionally not just expected stationarity to some degree, they've also been very much reactive. Normally in civil and criminal law was mostly where ideas of concern relating to the environment were expressed. It wasn't really the idea of a kind of ex ante risk assessment was not quite mainstreamed into law. But broadly speaking, this discourse can be traced to India, to the pretty horrific Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. For those who are perhaps unfamiliar with it, it was effectively the leakage of a lethal gas, methyl isocyanate, from a factory in a very, very busy city in India. And this raised massive questions about how the plant had been sited there, the permissions, the negligence in its operations. And this led in 1986 to the Indian Environmental Protection Act being established. The Environmental Protection Act is India's first primary legislation that deals with this idea of, firstly, protecting and improving the environment, and secondly, prevention of hazards. And this is conceptualized as a form of a framework umbrella legislation, which enables the state to then issue guidelines and notifications from time to time based on the issue it wishes to address. And it was under this EPA that in 94 and then in 2006, the Environment Impact Assessment Guidelines and notifications were issued. So this gives you sort of a very, very quick overview of how the court sort of proceeded on dealing with the idea that, oh, maybe we need to look at risk and decide what the landscape looks like long before the disaster has occurred, and then we're trying to desperately play catch up with everything that's gone on. So in general, risk assessment tends to span a few steps. It deals with the identification of a risk or risk. It looks at the possible consequences. It looks at the likelihood. It looks at an evaluation of alternatives and mitigating factors. And above all, it tries to look at principles and preferences to decide whether that risk is worth it. And this is sort of the question matrix that tends to confront the court when it comes to an issue of risk. And a good example is the case in which the court cites the precautionary principle for the first time. Interestingly, this case, which is the case of Vellore, which happened to deal with untreated tannery effluent, was not precisely what we would call indeterminate risk case, because the dangers of dumping tannery waste were very, very well known. However, the court chose, rather than invoking prevention or protection, to invoke the idea of precautionary principle, which of course is an international environmental law norm, to say that even in cases where there is no scientific certainty about the effects of the pollution or the action, the courts were still going to err on the side of caution and effectively shift the burden of proof onto the person proposing to do it to justify why their action was environmentally benign. Now, of course, there are certain fundamental issues here, mainly dealing with the idea of uncertainty. What you don't know, how are you presuming to then try and regulate and manage, which is more what the court is doing here. So the court has adopted the stronger version of this principle. However, it's used the precautionary principle in a few interesting ways. It's not just called for it in cases where the risk is known, or it's used it to, for example, break the tie when there is uncertainty in either direction. There was a case, for example, concerning the Chittorgarh fort in Rajasthan, where there was an issue about allowing blasting and mining in some proximity. I think it was 10 kilometers to the fort. And what the court had to decide, there were two conflicting expert reports allowing it. One allowed it and one said, no, this would harm the structural integrity. And so what the court goes on to then say is that we will err on the side of caution using the precautionary principle in order to safeguard heritage. So it's clearly invoking the principle as a guide to action in terms of just pausing with a potentially harmful action, even though they don't know that it will actually be harmful. Secondly, the court has begun using this principle to nudge the government along to better decision-making pathways. In a recent case concerning a thermal coal-powered plant, Jeet Kanwar, the court essentially held that although the plant had got an environmental clearance, the court held that there was no way the clearance would have been given if the ministry had actually applied the precautionary principle, which it was required to do so as a matter of environmental law and caution in the country. And therefore, it struck down that environmental clearance, saying that there was no way that they could have been, they could have applied their minds since they clearly hadn't taken cognizance of the potential risks of the plant. So I think this is a fairly creative way to bring uncertainty into policy making, because the policymakers were clearly not intending to abide by this principle at all. And the court, and they weren't necessarily required to do so by the letter of the law, so to speak. And the court says, well, you haven't, and therefore the clearance is gone. And these two are sort of looking at the idea of prevention and precaution on a sort of continuum. And writers like Lavanya Rajamani have commented that this is a fairly important area of law for India, because the courts have used this to even begin talking about science and uncertainty and risk within the Indian framework, rather than acknowledging that they live within fixities. And this idea of acknowledging uncertainty and a lack of technical expertise is what I'll come to in my next point, which is to set up expert committees. And this is something that the court very much likes doing when it is faced with any sort of uncertainty. So what the Indian courts have tended to do for example, in cases concerning pesticides, which have unknown impacts, in cases concerning genetically modified organisms, which again, the court deemed did not have the technical expertise to study, is to issue our terms of reference to set up new committees or set up expert panels to give reports to the court. To some degree, there is a cherry picking of what the court deems to be an acceptable report, particularly when there are conflicting ones on environmental damage. The court will often choose the one that aligns best with its perhaps other bases for action or other priorities or preferences. But this sort of recourse to technical expertise has been something the court has become very, very, very comfortable doing. And this, of course, raises important issues. For example, particularly in a world of radical uncertainty, particularly in a world of unknown unknowns, to what degree are any of these reports going to allow us to consider risk in a truly nebulous and we don't know what might happen sort of way? Because the idea of technical reports and expertise presumes that with a certain knowledge base that one can have an answer and that the court will use this answer to decide. This is absolutely, I would say, a very, very valid problem today. That said, the fact that the court is acknowledging that it needs a better and a more robust basis for decision making is not altogether a bad thing, because it's seeking independent corroboration of what it might intuitively believe. And it's often commissioning more studies and data. And while these studies are being carried out, the court often stops the potentially harmful activity, which is itself often a win for environmentalists, because until more information is gathered or the state of uncertainty is known, the environmentally harmful action does not continue. And this was the case, for example, in the case of endosulfan, which is a pesticide, and in the case of GMOs, where the court for some time banned field trials until more reports came in. And so these are two of the broadest ways in which the court has actually looked at this issue. And it's also interesting to see how they've brought these two within the judicial framework itself. In 2010, India set up its specialized environmental tribunal. And this tribunal, the NGT, the National Green Tribunal, has a constituent act which specifically asks the tribunal to decide cases on the basis of the precautionary principle. Again, bringing in the idea that uncertainty is something that the courts will have to grapple with and decide according to. Secondly, the idea of technical expertise, that ideas of risk might simply be beyond the sort of analytical frameworks familiar to the court, is again brought in because the NGT is supposed to have at least one judicial member and one technical expert member who could be a former scientist. So the idea of technical expertise is now mainstreamed into the bench itself. Again, it does raise questions about a top-down science-based paradigm, but the idea again is that if there is technical knowledge that needs to be parsed, that is now put together with judicial and legal knowledge about this area of law and environment in general. So moving on, the other primary response that India has had legislatively is to look at the environmental impact assessment framework. And in several court cases, it's been seen that the court sees environmental risk assessment as a part of the environment impact assessment framework itself. So also, although many might argue that EIAs are actually a subset of environmental risk assessments, in India, the court seems to see it in a more holistic sense. It's a part of the entire process. Now, EIAs are, in India, as in most other places, the devil is usually always in the details. The process tends to go via a screening, a scoping, preparation of the draft EIA, consultation, and appraisal. And at every stage, when you start from even the screening process, the idea is that the spatial extent of potential impacts and the potential impacts on health and natural and man-made resources will determine whether EIAs are mandatory or in some cases might be optional. And the option is at the behest of the authority, not at the behest of the project proponent. Second, it would go to the idea of a scoping where the environmental authority would frame the terms of reference according to which the project proponent would have to draft an EIA. It would then go towards the preparation of a draft EIA and a public consultation process, which would involve both written submissions and a hearing close to this potentially affected site. And finally, an appraisal, which is meant to be a reasoned decision by the authority. As I say again, the problem is usually always in how this is executed. There have been significant concerns about how good it is as a risk assessment framework, beginning from its very conception. For many people, when you talk about risk assessment, often it begins before everything else to even just simply map the lay of the land and even check for potential risks. In this case, it seems for a lot of people that the EIA process becomes more a mitigation and a compensation process that steps in once the potential risks have been either dismissed or assumed to be small enough to undertake the entire process to begin with. And this is a massive concern because at what stage is the EIA even conducted? Secondly, EIAs in India have again been held to fail on the risk assessment sort of guidelines because the quality of the reports produced is extremely flawed. They are prepared by the project proponents themselves, leading to a tremendous conflict of interest in what they include in the report. And short of striking down the environment clearance, to my knowledge at least, there doesn't seem to be any action taken for misrepresentation, lying, flat out omissions in the environmental report. And to give you an example of how egregious it can get, some of them are essentially copying and pasting from other unrelated EIA reports. There was one in which they actually put in species that were not even found in that region in the EIA report. They basically just got it from somewhere else, put it in. So if you don't have robust accountability and oversight mechanisms, what sort of a risk assessment paradigm are you even hoping to create in this scenario? And this is an open question that I think the courts have been asking, but on the face of it, the guidelines have utterly failed to meet that bar. And there's also this idea that public consultation comes in fairly late in the proceedings. One could argue that if you're looking at understanding the risk landscape, you need to put public consultation pretty much at the conception of the project itself. Right now, the public consultation element comes in after the draft EIA's report is drafted. Bad framing, that draft EIA is framed. And also, only once the project proponent is only required to respond to material concerns, and there's no real knowledge of what these material, we don't know what these material concerns need to be. And in many cases, they simply dismiss this element of accountability to answering the sort of questions that are raised. In fact, there have even been videos of public consultations where there have been people with guns present in the hall where the hearing was being held. Of course, in that particular case, the court actually struck down the environmental clearance by saying that the consultation could not be held to be free and fair when there are people with guns in the room. So there is that, but in their current form, EIAs are seen, although in one sense they might be seen as a manifestation of the prevention and protective principles and including the risk assessment ideas more broadly, in their actual operation on the ground, they don't really seem to have met that bar. And even more disturbingly, while the 2006 notification says that you cannot begin a project until the environmental clearance has been received, this is only applicable from 2006 onwards for the newer projects, not for the 94 projects onwards. So what often happens is work is commenced and then the clearance steps in, which means that the facts on the ground have changed so considerably that the court can't suddenly undo, say, a reservoir being built or 50% of a dam being built. So these are tremendously relevant issues for the risk paradigm in India today. So what could we do, right? When we talk about risk paradigm, I think that one area that India is really grappling with is to include a very a qualitative approach and a very quantitative approach. And what do I mean by that? Firstly, the idea that we need to understand vulnerabilities, intersectional risks, and on the ground scenarios. We do that to a very limited extent today in India. There is little background information or knowledge, and indeed, most of the information seems to be prepared by those who have a vested interest in actually to finish seeing a project through. Again, the conflict of interest part. The government, the public, there seems to be a paucity of available knowledge bases being created in the first place. Secondly, there is an overall reluctance to engage with uncertainty and the unknown. There have been others who have written about the idea of the fact that we are moving away from this nice Holocene envelope of stability, that we are moving towards a time where we don't know how the boundaries of our expectation are going to be radically altered. And the idea of dynamic stationarity, that change, even if it occurs, is bounded. We are moving away from that paradigm. Yet that acknowledgement seems to be within silos. There's an utter fragmentation of environmental governance, which means that even if one governmental body acknowledges risk and uncertainty, many others don't. And legislatively, certainly there's almost nothing, which means that the courts are really trying to put together piecemeal sort of approaches towards very complex problems. And we see this with complex adaptive systems, we see this with complex ecosystems, and the court trying desperately cobble together a framework to manage it. So education and awareness, public consultations, all of these are, I think, areas where there's a massive amount of work that needs to be done. But I'd like to conclude by looking at two primary things that the court has been trying to push. The first is the idea of an ecological rule of law. And it raised this not too long ago in a very, very interesting case, the Goa Airports case, which again dealt with the idea of an environmental clearance. The Goa Airport case was about building a second airport in the state of Goa, which is quite a tourist hub. I don't know if any of you have visited, but highly recommended. It's a great place. They wanted to build a new airport, but the clearance was obtained there seem to be outright omissions, if not lies, in the EIA report. And the court hauled them up very strongly on these before saying that before canceling the environmental clearance, they had, I think it led to some thousands of trees being cut down after the report had said that there are no trees in that region, things like that. And the court said that the EIA is an expression, when well done, of the environmental rule of law, which the court saw as a process-driven approach to ensure that laws are implemented. And the court used these lines to kind of talk about the fact, and I can read out a very, very brief extract from the judgment, where it says the process of the decision are as crucial as the ultimate decision itself. And not only must the norms be accepted, the processes by which the environmental decisions are taken have to be above board, have to be transparent, have to be accountable, because that is the only way you have responsive and honest systems of governance. So this is clearly putting a primacy on this idea of a process-driven environmental law, where you're looking at risk assessment not just being on paper, not just being done because it's a box-ticking exercise, but truly grappling with the questions, the uncertainties, the perhaps stepping back and saying, maybe this doesn't need to go forward. It's not like you greenlight an idea and then do an assessment. The idea of an environmental rule of law would say that you respect every stage of the process for what it is, instead of trying to gerrymander the entire process and reverse engineer it. And this, I think, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of what this might mean in practice, but the court dilates upon it and talks about a fidelity to process as much as substance. And I think this is really powerful. At the same time, the court is also talking about what it now calls an ecocentric development approach. And it did this interestingly in a case concerning the Asiatic lion, which is highly endangered and restricted to just one state in India. And the court in that says that development has become extremely anthropocentric, sustainable development is extremely human-centric and very instrumental in nature, it uses nature, and we need to move away from that towards a more holistic understanding that humans are only a part of the ecosystem. Again, not particularly radical for anyone who studied ecological development or ecocentric development or ecocentric thought, but the fact that a relatively conservative body like a judicial institution is actually directing the government to decide in relation with this principle, I think if you take those two together, you begin to have interesting insights for what a more robust, a more inclusive risk assessment paradigm in India could be. So to my mind, that would be something that recognized a healthy environment as a key to the right to life. It recognized the importance of sort of increasing resilience and decreasing vulnerabilities. Robin Kundis-Craig, in her article on adaptive governance, has these 5 sort of principles for looking at potential impacts on and how law itself should be adaptive. And I think those are also really relevant in this case, where you look at a more do no harm sort of approach towards the environment itself. And I suppose above all, maintain a certain deference and humility to potential impacts that human beings might have on the environment. A lot of what was discussed today comes in the realm of relative certainty, relatively unknown risks. But the precautionary principle already moves the needle from known risks to suspected risk, or as yet unquantifiable risk, or risk whose impacts are not known. And I think this is, if you take the idea of a rule of law, which is obviously aims at more participation, more listening, and if you look at the idea of an ecocentric approach towards development, I think you can maybe move the needle more towards looking at acknowledging this uncertainty within the law, and thereby not doing things as far as possible that will exacerbate current stresses that we've put on environmental and ecological systems. I think that's about it from me today, and thank you.
Thanks, Shalini. That was really a really fascinating overview of India's risk paradigm, and it was really interesting to kind of hear about the kind of activist role, in some sense, that the Indian judicial system has kind of taken towards really developing that risk paradigm. So that was really insightful and, yeah, really great to hear about. And so if anyone has any questions, we really encourage you to post them into the chat function, and we will get to them in the discussion period. So now we're going to hear from Jeff Garver, and for those who don't know, he's the co-founder of the Ecological Law and Governance Association and has written a lot on ecological law and governance. So I'll pass it on to Jeff.
Thanks, Emille, and good morning, afternoon, whatever it is for you, in whatever part of the world you're in. I will share my PowerPoint. Let's see. Thumbs up. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm very sorry that Tani couldn't join us. I was looking forward to hearing what she her presentation, putting all this in the context of the Arctic. I hope we have an opportunity to bring her work into the webinar series and in the overall work on the ecological law and governance that the organizations involved in this series and in EL&G and the leadership for the Ecozoic program are doing. But I've done quite a bit of thinking about these issues in my work on my thesis and my ongoing research. So I'll just give you a feel for some of the things that I've come across. I thought it'd be interesting here, or useful, to just start by considering the many structural features of legal systems that we have to take into account when we're thinking about how to deal with complexity and uncertainty in the law. So the first point is that any legal system is always in a broader context. So it is interlinked and interacting in what we call a panarchy of a number of complex systems. So you have ecological systems, social systems, political, culture, and economic systems. And the law doesn't stand alone with those. It is interacting across all of them in a big, as I said, panarchy. And the other thing is that we can think of law as ultimately being an evolving constellation of rights, freedoms, constraints, and prohibitions. I've adapted that from the work of J.B. Rule, who Emille mentioned. And within that, there's a number of elements that come into play. So first of all, any legal system is built on a set of overarching principles or an ethical framework, a worldview, a paradigm, if so to speak. And I think that's very, very important to keep in mind as we consider what ecological law that accounts for complexity and uncertainty might be. Then there's the things that we're more used to associating with law. A set of constitutions, codes, and statutes would set out the fundamental rights and structures of a legal system and the jurisdiction to which it applies, whether that be a nation or something more local or international. You have additional legal instruments like decrees, edicts, executive orders, and so on. Typically, administrative rules and regulations that provide details to constitutions, codes, and statutes. In many parts of the world, you have common law, which exists in areas like property, equity, torts, contracts, and so on. And then transcending national boundaries, you have international law, treaties, international agreements, and other forms of international law. And I always like to, I'm definitely an adherent or believer in taking a legal pluralistic approach, in which law can also include informal arrangements that embody societal rules and expectations, but that nonetheless provide a degree of predictability and so on. So the next thing to consider is that you have a lot of actors and agents institutions and power structures that are part of the legal system. So typically in most governance systems, you have the legislative branch, which is saying what the law is. Then you have an executive or administrative branch, which implements and enforces the law, and then a judicial branch, which ultimately interprets the law in specific cases. You also have the overarching governance regimes. Now, this will typically be set out in a constitution, but it could be a democracy, a dictatorship. If we look at the world, we can see that there are many, many different kinds of governance regimes in which these other legal elements are housed. And then there are all the things in the law that give relative power and roles to different individuals and to private and public institutions. So you can have systems that are very much focused on public ownership. So I guess a pure socialist or communist system would be like that, to ones that are very much focused on giving the predominant degree of power to private entities. And finally, you have many, many different arenas, and I'm certainly not pretending to be comprehensive here, but you have tax and money systems, corporate law and finance, commerce and trade, laws about inheritance, environmental law, energy and natural resources law, health, property, human rights, biodiversity, agricultural and food, urbanization, transportation, and so on. This is, I'm really just trying to get us all to see the broadness with which, the broadness of the elements that make up a legal system. So what do we talk about when we talk about ecological law? Well, in my writing, now if you've seen my presentation before, you are the first ever to see that I've now added what I believe to be a key feature of ecological law. And what I've done here is I've listed those 11, and I've put in bold the ones that I think that are maybe particularly relevant to our discussion today on uncertainty and complexity. So humans as part of Earth's life systems, the primacy of ecological limits, and I'll get back to that, especially I was very interested in Shalini's presentation and how, what are the implications when we give primacy to ecological limits, taking it to into account some of the notions she put forth. So here's the new one: emphasis on sufficiency and need over efficiency and utility or desires. I've come to see that as a really key feature of what we're talking about in ecological law, and certainly one that underscores how far we are from fully having a system of ecological law. Fully integrated into legal and policy infrastructure. In other words, it can't be something like environmental law, which is a bit of a sideshow. It has to affect all those arenas that I had in the previous slide. It implies, given the current state of affairs, radical reduction of material and energy use. It needs to be global when there are global problems like climate change. And that, linked to that, there have to be supranational rules. In other words, the strong role of states and sovereignty in our current system would have to give way along the lines of what's happened in Europe. I've put in this notion of sharing. And then really, when we're dealing very much with complexity and what is implied by complexity, including uncertainty, the need for expanded research and monitoring that responds to that complexity and uncertainty. Caution about crossing ecological boundaries, so it's like the planetary boundaries. And then as especially Emille's presentation pointed out, but also Shalini's when she talked about adaptive governance, the need to be adaptive. Let me say that in terms of caution, I think we really need to think through what we're talking about when we put the precautionary principle, when we tie it to planetary boundaries. It's a little different than I think some of the very nice examples that Shalini gave us, because in some sense, if we're talking about climate change, and your rule is, if you put it in layman's terms, you can't do something that risks, or where there's uncertainty as to whether it crosses a planetary boundary until you have a degree of, until you resolve that uncertainty. In other words, you err in favor of caution. If you think about what that implies in terms of climate change and our infrastructure for fossil fuels, it's quite a big challenge. So I wanted to just emphasize that a little bit. Then I want to just review here quickly some essential characteristics of the effective rule of law, at least how we see them today. So there's, in typical legal systems, a strong emphasis on clarity and certainty. For example, it's very hard to hold somebody criminally responsible unless the law has been clear, they've been given notice of it, and so on, and there's some certainty about it. But systems dynamics and adaptive responsiveness are complicated and filled with uncertainty. So you have a paradox there. Law is typically enforceable, but if you look at the situation we have today, effective enforcement is especially challenging at the global level. When we're talking about planetary boundaries, it's where it is really needed. And then there's always this notion of legitimacy, but democratic institutions tend toward democratic deficits at large supranational scales, and state sovereignty remains a significant barrier at the kind of, at the full scale of ecological law that would be needed. So now when I turn, I'll bring this all together when I put out these elements down to some features of complex adaptive systems. Okay. So first of all, as I mentioned, the panarchy, I think this is a concept we need to have a common understanding of, and I understand it as the notion that the human Earth system is an integration of many different complex adaptive systems, such as ecosystems, legal systems, and so on, the ones I mentioned earlier, that operate across scales and disciplines. And then my understanding of what a complex adaptive system is that it's an evolving dynamical system that continually adapts resilient strategies in response to irreducible uncertainty, nonlinearity, chaos, emergence, and catastrophe, so as to maintain the system's fundamental attributes. For example, its functional identity and its principal feedback mechanisms. And a complex adaptive system then can be thought of having a kind of stable disequilibrium. And relevant also to our discussion of complexity and uncertainty is the idea of resilience. And I found quite persuasive this idea of thinking of resilience in two ways. Engineering resilience is the resilience of, say, an industrial agricultural facility, where you want, and it involves the ability to return to a narrow set of equilibrium conditions with a focus on efficiency, control, consistency, and predictability. And this is in contrast to ecological resilience, which is the ability to absorb disturbances, creating non-equilibrium conditions so as to maintain system function and structure, where the focus is instead on persistence, adaptability, diversity, variability, and unpredictability. And I'll refer back to some of this later. Oops. Yeah. So what is a complex adaptive legal system then? So the basic concept, and there's been quite a number of scholars. So Robin Craig, who was mentioned, J.B. Rule, and others have done a lot of work on trying to describe what this is. So these are legal systems that can evolve in nonlinear ways, have emergent properties, and experience chaos and catastrophe, yet maintain their fundamental attributes. It's very important to remember that in any system, including legal systems, adaptiveness and resilience in law can be both harmful or beneficial. So one of the ways in which our current legal system is quite adaptive and resilient is in maintaining a growth insistence approach. And I and many others working in the area of ecological law see this as a huge obstacle to where we need to go. So that's adaptive and resilience, that if you have a shift in worldviews in mind, is quite problematic. The other thing that I still am working on and trying to understand is that the human element in a complex adaptive legal system is very important. So we have to acknowledge that there's free will in the design and operation of legal systems and other social systems, and this is something that can make them even more complex than other systems. An example that illustrates, I think, this is in the area of ecological restoration. So if you just have an ecosystem and without human intervention, allow it to follow a particular path, that's much different when you have human intervention and an ecological restoration. This is typically to achieve a particular set of pre-designated goals or objectives for that ecosystem. So you may be still dealing with complex adaptive systems there, but the human element has a big effect. So just then the attractors, without getting into what that exactly means, this is really just saying that some of the key variables we're dealing with in legal systems are freedoms, rights, regulations, and prohibitions. So freedoms, I am allowed to do something. Rights, I can insist on something being done. Regulations, I can be constrained or limit the way I do something. And prohibitions, I may not do something. So I think there's some more adaptives in here from Rule. He sees the ultimate challenge in dealing or understanding laws as a complex adaptive legal system is that lawyers must craft a durable administrative law for adaptive management, one that satisfies norms of stability, legitimacy, public participation, and judicial review, while truly allowing adaptive management to be adaptive. So adaptive management, at least in his work and certainly in my thinking, and in terms of what's needed for ecological law, it's a key element. And just as a quick introduction, I'm going to talk a little more about it. Adaptive management would typically involve monitoring a certain set of things that you've decided are important to monitor, continual adjustment in light of what you find out from that monitoring, and back end in addition to front end adjustments, which might be called loop management. And here, I think we can see from Shalini's examples, and certainly my and many others' research on how and experience in how environmental impact assessment regimes work, they're typically only pre-decisional. Now, some EIA processes do indicate the need for monitoring to see whether the assessment, whether the predictions and so on actually were true, and if they weren't, to make adjustments. But in practice, this is very, very, very rarely done. And that's a huge problem in having a truly adaptive management, adaptive approach. Again, the precautionary principle, and here, again, we're talking about precaution with respect to planetary boundaries and other key ecological limits. And then I think it also has to be transdisciplinary, maybe responding to Shalini's comment about the siloization of some of all this. Just an example of how we can see a legal system adapting in light of complexity is the evolution of common law of public nuisance from treating wetlands as a nuisance to treating their destruction as a nuisance. And I'm referring to a Rhode Island Supreme Court case from 2005 that illustrates that. So key notions for aligning law with a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. So this is a concept that I and many others associate with ecological law. So this would be sort of an overarching objective that we can juxtapose, for example, to growth insistence. First, and this is a bit of review, we need an adaptive management system with a monitoring adjustment framework, strong awareness of spatial and temporal scales that don't stop at the nation-state border, a focus on ecological instead of engineering resilience, and understanding that adaptiveness and resilience can maintain systems that support as well as systems that undermine a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship, and that precaution about crossing ecological limits is essential. So let's consider a little bit more adaptive management, which really is a way to deal with uncertainty and complexity. First of all, what needs to be monitored? So this is just sort of a working list again. Trends in the law against metrics of a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. Now, you can think of, for example, the planetary boundaries or the donut. So you have the social justice issues on the inside. That's Kate Rayworth's work. The suitability and effectiveness of those metrics. So we might be monitoring whether the metrics themselves need to change over time. The relationships between human-driven material and energy flows and key life support systems. And I'll have an illustration of that as I close this presentation. The linkages between components of the legal system and their key impacts, cross-scale relationships, finance, trade, and economic transactions and their linkages to law, as well as their linkages to things like planetary boundaries, legislation, court rulings, implications from constitutions, and so on. So actually the key workings of the legal system, and ultimately rights, freedoms, constraints, and prohibitions. Do those have to be adjusted? Well, you have to monitor them to know. So the next thing, and maybe this is the first thing, but it wouldn't have fit on one slide. So what is management? What are we managing in light of this monitoring? Well, all of the structural elements of the legal system that I started this presentation with would in theory be subject to management or adjustment depending on the results of monitoring. Adaptive management itself, that was it comes from the quote that Emille had and the one that I shared with you. Environment, so this would be sort of what we do in ecological restoration, but more importantly, human behavior and actions and their impacts. And related to that, human-earth interactions and their impacts. Energy material flows and the intermediaries that allow them, finance, property markets, and trade. So these are things that, again, would need to be managed based on the results of monitoring consistent with ecological law. And then I want to highlight the role of time. So when we're thinking of adaptive management, we have to be aware of the past, and particularly a path dependency. In other words, the past determines the future in many sense, and it also sets up trends that in some cases can take very, very long time to alter. The present, where are we now, and the future. And again, this is where uncertainty really comes into play. And again, the path dependency, what's possible given what's happened in the past. Transition is also a future-oriented concept. You have to be concept of things within the system that are fast-moving or that respond quickly, and things that are slow moving. So a climate system, for example, the global climate system versus, for example, a rainstorm coming through. How long do response and feedback, how long are response and feedback times, and how are many different response and feedback times that are relevant to a problem interact with each other over long time scales. And then finally, given the actual state of the world, how do we deal with this need for urgent action while also acknowledging that law traditionally has tended to evolve very, very slowly? This is just an illustration of this idea of a path dependency. You know, we can imagine a scenario, for example, that tomorrow there will only be 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, but because of path dependency and what's happened in the past, that's no longer future. So we have a subset of what's imaginable, and which is what is actually possible because of path dependence, as we consider how to move from a growth insistent paradigm to one that focuses on human earth enhancement and ecological law. What are some of the things that impede a complex adaptive legal system that enhances ecological integrity and a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship? Well, in our current system, there's little accounting of scale, both temporal and geographical. I think if you think a clear indicator that is the predominance of the sovereign state. The desire for uncertainty in the law, where an adaptive managed system inherently involves a certain amount of uncertainty or change that's not always predictable. Obviously, there's resistance to change of many features of legal systems and the systems with which legal systems interact. Right, there's a tendency, or at least a danger, that ecological law will be considered a response only to environmental law as opposed to all kinds of law in the full legal system. And J.B. Rule has identified some particular obstacles to adaptive management in the U.S. administrative system legislatures are very wary of doing this. The public is wary of it, and courts are not used to it. Another thing to think about as we imagine a transition to ecological law that addresses law's complexity and uncertainty is where you can make the most difference. And I'll just quickly refer to this work by Donella Meadows on levels of intervention in systems, and that you can have the greatest impact if you're dealing with changing mindsets or paradigms underlying these systems. So for example, growth insistence versus a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship, right down to when you're just adjusting things on the surface. And actually, this is a lot of what law does. Approving subsidies, tax rates, pollution standards, and so on. I won't go through this entire slide, but I've come up with some examples in legal systems. So Shalini referred to an ecocentric paradigm. Well, if you really are comprehensive about it, that's a very, very fundamental shift. Also at the core here, at the sort of the areas of intervention points where you have a lot of impact, confronting economic growth, and replacing that ultimate goal of our entire set of social systems with mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. You'd have a lot of impact, but obviously it's very, very difficult to do. And you'll see the other examples I have for other points that Donella Meadows identified. Here, I don't want to spend too much time in this slide. It's really intended just to give you a picture of complexity when we're dealing with the systems that law has to confront with, taking into account complexity and uncertainty from the local to the global scale. So what you have is consideration of local socioeconomic drivers, the socioeconomic pressures or environmental pressures that result from those, and how those are linked across regional boundaries to similar drivers and impacts at regional up to global system levels. An illustration of this in terms of climate change would be if you have a boundary metric. So, for example, one on which you're basing a precautionary approach at a planetary scale, like CO2 in the atmosphere. You would move from there to what are the pressures of concern, greenhouse gas emissions and decreasing of carbon sinks. What are the economic drivers that create those pressures, fossil fuel combustion, deforestation, and so on. How are those drivers, impacts, and possible constraints distributed? So you can do that looking at sectoral distribution, parsing down material and energy flows, looking at it geographically or ecosystemically, and so on. And then once you've got that all mapped out, you can consider societal responses, including responses in the law. So what are some of the options as the planetary boundaries, authors put it, among the many myriad pathways to development that we have in which you would stay within a planetary boundary for carbon dioxide. And I think I'll close with this slide. This is just really a summary of an adaptive methodology where you start today, with a particular paradigmatic framework, whether and so I focused here on a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. You look at existing laws, indicators, and indicators of the law's impacts on the human-earth relationship, and through the application of a legal regime, experience, research and monitoring, assessment of impacts and effectiveness, consideration of trade-offs, you are continually refining norms and objectives, and continually refining the legal system and the indicators that you're monitoring as you work towards the ultimate goal. So thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. Particularly as well at late notice for you to step in with such a detailed overview of adaptive governance. That was really fantastic. So we've got maybe 13 minutes or so for questions, and we've got a few questions in the chat function. So we've got, first of all, we've got a question from Catherine, and she's asked, is there a body of scientists working on developing a precautionary science? What would it look like? So instead of panels of experts on certain topics that may raise uncertainty, we have experts on uncertainty and how to deal with it. So from my end, I do know that there are scientists working at the kind of Santa Fe Institute on complexity. There's also a lot of people working on Earth system science and Earth system governance and so forth. And I'm sure that Shalini and Jeff, you would probably also know of different organizations that are kind of more interested in kind of complex adaptive science, and also there's a lot happening in the ecological sciences sphere, I think, as well.
Yeah, I guess go ahead, Shalini.
No, I was just going to say that I think, I don't know if there's any organization that is solely focused on uncertainty to that extent in India, but there are certainly several specialized scientific bodies that are carrying out scientific research on, for example, oceans, or the agricultural systems, or what the implications of climate change might be. So I would say it's knowledge that's the scientific community is probably comfortable with, but it's fairly, I don't think there's any unified mechanism for the collation or collection or preparation of such knowledge that comes to mind. I could be wrong. But I think the court, to a certain degree, is aware of who to call upon, or who will, because very often when setting up these committees, it sets out who the members of the committees will be. And it often picks government scientists or other scientists or experts from these fields in cases where it can't just call a certain expert and ask them to speak. So there are for sure bodies of scientists that work on these issues of complexity and adaptive governance, even if there's no one particular body that does it.
Yeah, I was going to mention the Stockholm Resilience Center and the people who were working on the planetary boundaries. I mean, that's really become quite a broad set of researchers. And of course, it's interlinked, I think, with many other research projects around the world. You have Future Earth, which is now a clearinghouse for some of the global scale scientific research, both in the social sciences and the physical sciences. You have programs like Leadership for the Ecozoic, and I'm sure we're aware of some of the other ones that are linked to it. The Institute for Social Ecology and the Austrian, I forget what the name of that university, where Helmut Haberl and Maria Fischer-Kowalski and so on, where the work they're doing is all relevant. So there's certainly plenty of out there. It's really the connection between how that work and the policy realm. I mean, just think of that work, and then think of the legislatures that are adopting laws day in and day out, and I think you can quickly see the disconnect.
Great. We've also got a comment here as well from Ben, who you talked a little bit about the need to kind of focus more on vulnerability. Did you want to comment further on that, Ben?
Sure, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to the presentations. So the notion of vulnerability could be a framework to develop a sort of a stronger ecological ethic, because what it really does is respect the idea that we can't control and manage and resolve and mitigate all the ups and downs and upheavals of the Anthropocene. And I'll give you a few examples. So take floodplains. Most societies are obsessed with controlling floods. We want to dam rivers. There's a major dispute in Australia in regard to the Warragamba Dam near Sydney. And the idea there is to raise the dam by 14 metres so that it would control any major floods in a torrential downpour one day that would flood the valley below where people in Sydney live. So the idea is that we have to spend a fortune in money in order to control a river system to prevent a flood. The alternative paradigm would be to say, well, we respect that this is an area where nature allows water to flow and we don't want people living there, or we have better flood evacuation plans, or we build houses on stilts. An example from India, and it's not alone, but occasionally you hear of a man-eating tiger in India and 13 villages have been killed and they have to hunt it down and kill it. You know, an ethic of vulnerability would respect, well, you know, in certain forests, tigers live, dangerous carnivores exist, and we have to coexist with that. And that means accepting that certain people may die in those areas. And I don't want to pick on India, but I'll give you an example from Australia again. Periodically, a surfer or a swimmer is killed in Australian waters by a shark. And there's a frenzy in the media about, oh, we've got to hunt down that man-killer shark and remove it. I mean, an ethic based on vulnerability would say, well, if you're going to swim in the ocean, there's a risk that you're going to get killed by a shark. We create certain areas that are netted. These are safe areas. But if you go outside of that, you understand that you will be vulnerable to the forces of nature, and the law's not going to intervene to try to save you or to kill off those creatures. So this dominance of resilience, I understand what it's about, and I think that the presentations have done well to stress the need for the law to do more on it. But I worry that we're not moving sufficiently away from this paradigm of control and mastery of nature. Mm-hmm. I know it's about, you know, we've got to live, coexist with nature, but if we really want to coexist with nature, we respect the agency of nature to enter our lives. And that means respecting the degree of vulnerability. And I don't mean that people go without water. It doesn't mean that we go without food. I don't mean, you know, allowing sort of awful deprivation. But it does mean tolerating a certain level of exposure to the ups and downs and uncertainties and risks of nature, and just letting ourselves live with that. And I saw in the chat line, Catherine had made a comment too about the need to live with a world of unknowns. Catherine?
Yeah, I think she might have.
Let me. I just want to I just wanted to point out that or note that I think that the rights of nature movement is really trying to deal with a lot of what Ben just said by repositioning humans as one element of the full set of ecosystems that make up the planet. And if you push them to the extreme, maybe you would get to the results of you know, different power balance between humans and other parts of nature. And, you know, the danger there is, I think, if you look at Donella Meadows' list of points of intervention, with something like rights of nature, if you only are tinkering around the edges without also focusing on some of the core points of intervention, the paradigmatic shifts, the shifts in goals, you may run into trouble. But that is certainly, that's part of what we're thinking about when we think about ecological law.
Oh, good.
Yes, I think, Ben, your point is very well taken about moving away from perhaps this very managerial effort, particularly the hard engineering solutions to managing vulnerability and risk and resilience. I think that's absolutely relevant point, very well taken. That said, however, and I'm going to come back to the two examples you took in the Indian, well, one on floodplains and the other in the issue of the tiger. And when it comes to vulnerability, while I do understand the broader point that you're taking, that it ends up being very anthropocentric, the way we structure our thinking on this matter, the fact also is that those who are most vulnerable are those who are least able to adapt, change, or, you know, look at the kind of exposure they have to things that they would consider dangerous. And this is the idea of the intersectional analysis also in this context, that when it came to the issue of the tiger, for instance, now there are much, much larger critiques about habitat destruction, problematic governmental policies, and why we have this issue of quote-unquote man-animal conflict. But given the fact that people on the ground were dying, I don't know that anyone has the right, except the people concerned, to say that they should die. And to that extent, I think that solutions that may not be ideal, but maybe trying to embrace a middle role, trying to see what can be done, even in cases where the paradigm itself can't be changed, maybe needed to be resorted to on a case-by-case basis. I don't think they can be rejected wholesale, because poverty is an issue. Facts on the ground are an issue. For example, we can put floodplain management in India, and we definitely need to move away from this very let's build a wall here and kind of like a levee here and so on and so forth, which is how floods they've tried to manage. That said, there will probably, given the density of human populations in this area and the absolute impossibility of resettling them, both as a pragmatic and as a political choice, I think in many cases, there will have to be a middle ground adopted, which is where the idea of reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience will also need to be resorted to wherever appropriate. So absolutely, I take your point, but I also think that the realities on the ground might sometimes push back quite strongly against sort of the more theoretical approaches that could be taken in this regard.
Thank you. Very good points. I like them. Thank you.
Great. And Shalini, I had one quick question as well. That was a really interesting discussion too about vulnerability, and you raised some interesting justice concerns, that kind of approach. Found that interesting. And I was quickly going to ask, just before we wrap up, I was really interested in, because you talked a lot about the kind of the Indian courts kind of taking an activist role to the risk paradigm in India. And I was really interested just quickly if you have any thoughts on the kind of political response that there has been in, I guess, from the legislature, but also from the general public as well, and whether it's been viewed favorably or etc.
So what we do find is that there are a range of responses. And I think this tracks quite interestingly onto the fact that the litigant in many of these cases the defendant rather, ends up being the government. And it's usually in India, a lot of private parties, private actors, NGOs, environmentalists, affected persons who take the case to court. So there is, very often it's a government who's losing the case. So that definitely sets up a certain potential for a backlash. However, I would say, I'm not aware of any uniform response. In a lot of cases, there is a huge deference usually given to what the court is saying, at least on the face of it. So in many cases, the government would comply, even if it does so reluctantly, and it says that it will try and find a way out of this imbroglio. In certain cases, the government has responded by weakening the guidelines or the norms, which is within its remit to do so, however problematic that might be. These will, of course, end up being challenged on grounds of constitutionality, on other grounds, but it is true that the government has on occasion tried to lower or reduce the protections available, or even change the laws and guidelines wholesale. So that is also a response that they have taken on occasion. Very often what we see is that the government comes back and tries to itself be creative, and in both good ways and bad. In good ways, they'll sometimes address the court's issues. The courts can be activists, but the courts on the whole, in certain strands of cases, particularly public interest invoked cases, whether or not that is truly in the public interest, separate question. The courts do tend to either defer to the government or work with the government to find non-zero-sum kind of solutions going forward. And I think that's also a hallmark of environmental law, that there's very often this effort to find a way to move forward on a more collaborative basis. So that's often a place for the government to express the political actors, rather, more broadly speaking, to, of course, looking at political in a very narrow sense here, not in the broader social response, which I can get to later. And that often includes their inputs into things going forward. However, it is my personal observation, and this is an area maybe for more detailed research in the future, done very little now, that in cases where it involves federal issues, the courts have something like that would involve multiple authorities to act together to the courts sometimes refrain from enforcing their orders. So they might say it, they might say, why are you not following it? But they don't always use the full range of powers that they do have, which includes a very wide-ranging contempt jurisdiction, so on and so forth, to actually haul up offending governments and take them. We see this in the case of wetlands in India, for example, that there have been endemic problems with wetlands, their demarcation and protection. And honestly, apart from just saying, please kind of at least demarcate the wetlands, the court hasn't really taken offending governments to account for their laggardliness. And this in part might be due to the fact that there would be multiple coordinating authorities involved. And so the court sometimes does just give the executive time on the government or the legislature time to get its act together. There are a range of responses. Socially speaking, I think the court enjoys a lot of support among people who see it as almost a last resort for much of the environmental problems in the country. The courts have fashioned a very powerful environmental jurisprudence. Of course, there are a lot of critiques about whether the court has favored certain, say, urban interests more than others. They have favored issues of pollution over, say, livelihood. And so those are critiques which it would require another, I think, presentation to go into. But generally, the popular consensus seems to be that in a highly, sometimes dysfunctional system, the court can be seen as a kind of supra actor in some sense, holding authorities to account. And I think it's really important to not underplay the symbolic role of the court's decision. And I think a recent, this is something I was speaking to an activist who was involved in the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which was essentially about Narmada River and the dam that was raised on it. And they ultimately didn't win the case. And I was like, so many years, you know, what were you thinking at that moment? Did you ever regret going to court, or what were your thoughts there? And her answer was fascinating. She was saying that, look, we got the highest court of the land to give us a hearing, to give us what we felt. We had our day in court. Our voices, our problems were heard. They did stop it for a few years. There were directions to the government, and we felt listened to. And I think this is not something to understate in terms of a symbolic value, and also just the cathartic value of the court and its role in the public environmental sphere, so to speak. And finally, on symbolic, right, the rights to nature paradigm, which is increasingly becoming popular. But I want to raise the issue of the Ganga, the river Ganga, being accorded a living person status. Now, symbolically, this is hugely powerful. I mean, it obviously follows on, and the decision in that case cites the New Zealand decision. And it's from a hortatory point of view, and even as just a symbolic point of view, it's so intuitively appealing and powerful. However, if you look at the actual judgment itself, it's really not that great. Because it starts off by saying public authorities aren't doing their job. The Ganga is now a person. Its guardians are public authorities that we just said weren't doing their job. And so you're like, there seems to be some kind of dissonance very baked into the system. But the thing is, most people will not read the judgment, and it won't matter, because the law also means what common consensus agrees that it means, sometimes in really positive ways. So if you have a larger narrative and a discourse around this personhood of complex ecosystems, who's to say that this does not become a very powerful rallying point, as I know it has for environmental activists in India and even abroad, for really seeing this as a way to advance claims based on that. And if that is done, who's to say that tomorrow we won't have a better judgment that, you know, delineates this even better? So it's a dialectical process to some degree. And symbolism is not something to be understated in that respect. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's So we're gonna have to leave it there for interest of time. So I want to thank both Jeff and Shalini and all of the participants. I thought that was really interesting. And thank you for your comments and your questions. This will be available online as well on the ELGO website further down the line. Thank you. And have a great day,
Thanks,
evening.
Emille.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.